Bad Boys of the Civil War. He's done a program already back a couple of weeks ago.
Yep.
He is a pastor. Well, you're kind of current pastor, aren't you?
I'll give you a VTOC quickly. How's that?
That'll work.
I know me more than most
Bingo.
anybody. I'm Bob Williams. I was born and raised in Kansas City, but we had a farm in Sedalia where we raised registered polled herd cattle. And so because of that experience, my folks decided that they should send me off to vet school. So I went to veterinary school and to pre-vet, got a degree in animal science, and decided that I didn't like messing around with cattle as much as I did with people. And so I got the call to the ministry. I went to Nashotah House Episcopal Seminary, which was very monastic, and since they knew I had a bit of an agricultural background, they offered me the opportunity to milk cows for my tuition. So I milked cows, 135 on the string, and put buck bales and silage up there and everything. And I was really glad then, after I graduated with a Master's of Divinity, I was very glad I had left agriculture for a while. After that, then I got a doctorate at McCormick Theological Seminary at the University of Chicago, and the bishop sent me then to West Plains, and I was the vicar in West Plains in the early 70s. I was a brand new kid right into the ministry. About 4 years later, I did a tradition, and I ran away and joined the Navy. And so for 25 years, I was a chaplain for the Navy and the Marine Corps. I ended up as the command chaplain for the Fleet Marine Force Pacific. I was a supervisor for 242 chaplains in 88 different denominations from the Persian Gulf to Guatemala. Pretty big parish. When I retired from that, I was called to be the rector of Epiphany Church in Seattle. And then I moved back home to West Plains. And I got home and thought I'd relax. And of course, the bishop said, by the way, there's a vacancy. Would you mind filling in at your old church? So at that time, my first church and my last church was All Saints West Plains. Of course, then I moved here and I discovered that that was not my last church.
Which one of these do you want to try?
I move around a lot. So
Okay.
whatever. Anyway, at the University of Missouri, as a freshman, we had to take history. And I absolutely hated it because all we had to do was memorize dates. And so the more involved in over the years, and especially teaching and studying and writing about church history. In fact, when I was at Epiphany in 8 years, I wrote what is known as the brief history of the Christian church. People laughed at me because they said brief. And in 8 years, I got up to the 16th century. And so after that, I sort of quit church history and went into history of the Civil War, because I've been stationed in all these places, in Virginia, North Carolina, and places that were very steeped in the history of the Civil War. And I also had a bit of a family history. I won't give it all away. You can purchase this book on Amazon. It gets 5 stars. It's $15, and you can hear it. A computer will read it, or you can buy it like this. But this encapsulates some of my family history. What are you going to do? Fix me up here. Some of my.
I'm not sure where you want it.
Oh, I don't care. I'm not used to these things.
It only delivers a small electrical charge.
Well, maybe we need that for some people, so in case they go to sleep. Anyway, I will tell you one. I'll tell you one.
Yes.
You can buy the book and find the real story, but I have one of my ancestors, Billy Payton. And Billy Payton was an interesting character, but one of the time he and some of his rowdy friends, bushwhackers, went they were in Howard County, Missouri. And there's a little town up the road called Rocheport. And there was a big German community there in that time, and whatever. And anyway, Uncle Billy went to this barn dance with some of his buddies. And they were, let's say, got a little liquored up. And so after the music started, there was this big, hefty Dutchman there who was playing the violin. And Uncle Billy went up to him and he said, he says, if I couldn't play the violin, no, it was the fiddle. If I couldn't play the fiddle any better than that, I'd break it. And this Dutchman gives him the fiddle and Uncle Billy breaks it. There were about 60 or 70 irate Germans after him, and he swam the Missouri River on horseback. That's Uncle Billy. Billy Peyton. All right, that's enough about me. I guess we ought to talk a little bit about the bad boys of the Civil War, and I'm going to set the scene because it is all about states' rights and slavery, but the issues are intertwined. But there's a whole lot of bad boys, and that's what we're going to deal with tonight. The theater of the Civil War, of course, covered the South and even Pennsylvania and New Mexico. But my focus is going to be on Missouri and Kansas, where the trouble was brewing many years before the establishment of the Confederacy. In 1821, the population of Missouri was 60,000 folks. 10,000 of those were African American slaves. 10,000. Mostly located along the Missouri River. Now, in order to maintain a balance between slave and free states, the United States government devised a plan called the Missouri Compromise. And under this plan, Missouri was to be admitted to the Union as a slave state and Maine as a free state. Slavery was also banned north of the Missouri border. And then in 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, creating 2 new territories, and they repealed the Missouri Compromise. And the plan was to allow residents of these new territories to choose if they wanted to be a free state or a slave state. In other words, it would be majority rule, and they call this popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty. Now, plantations along the Missouri River were heavily populated by slaves. Ms. Cynthia Smith had 106 slaves. William P. Sweeney from Howard County had 95. And if you wanted the distinction to be a planter, if you owned 20 slaves, then you could be a planter. Otherwise, you were just a slave owner. In the early 50s, a fragile peace existed between the Kansas Territory and Missouri State. The free soil people versus the pro-slavery folks. Now, in order to establish citizenship in the Kansas Territory, all you had to do was build a house and live in it. Now, abolitionists in Massachusetts funded thousands of New Englanders and foreign immigrants to move to Kansas. Southern planters and speculators approved of Nebraska being a free state, but they believed strongly that Kansas should be a slave state. Now, among the towns in Kansas, the New England Company, whose treasurer was Amos G. Lawrence, who established the town Lawrence. And Lawrence was modeled after a typical New England village. And it became the seat of anti-slavery in that whole area. Now, as an aside, I just must say the Episcopal Church and School in Lawrence became eventually the University of Kansas. That's hard as a guy from Mizzou, okay? Pro-slavery politicians became concerned over this artificial populating by an excessive number of Yankee abolitionists. Pro-slavery citizens wishing to protect their interest and their way of life organized protective societies. The Platte County Self-Defense Association had over 1,000 members. The Northern press named these activists border ruffians. And these men, however, were not riffraff, but prominent citizens and politicians. It was the acclaimed journalist in the New York Times, Horace Greeley, of Go West Young Man fame, who coined the word border ruffian. But in fact, the border was pretty rough. It was a kind of a mean place. The first recorded incident occurred in 1854 when there was an argument between a pro-slaver and a free stater, and the free stater got angry at him and shot the slaver dead. No legal consequences. Charles Robinson, the territorial governor at the time, he requested some help to help calm things down along the border. He requested them from the Yankee Aid Society, and the aid came in the form of 100 Sharps carbines in crates marked Bibles. And the 54 caliber carbine was the state-of-the-art weapon at that time, and so free state residents of Kansas were very well armed. The new residents of the Kansas Territory were ready to fight. The first bad boy that I want to introduce you to, who is the foremost leader of the Kansas militias, and his name was James Henry Jim Lane. He was known as the Grim Chieftain. Give you an idea. The Grim Chieftain. And then and now his detractors paint him as an unbalanced, pugnacious jayhawker. He was born in Indiana, practiced law, served as lieutenant governor there, and also in the United States Congress. And he moved to Kansas in 1854, where he became deeply involved in the free state politics of the time, and he established an organization known as the Frontier Guard. He led many raids into Missouri under the orders of General Fremont, and his jayhawking, or red legs, were called for his followers, his organization, and they were called Redlegs because they wore red leggings. They swept a wide path of pillage, arson, murder of the private citizens of Missouri, and his most famous raid was the sacking of Osceola, Missouri. If you ever go into Kansas City out of Springfield on Highway 13, you'll go past the Osage River. About the only thing you know now about Osceola is the cheese factory, okay? But in those days, it was a thriving community at the headwaters of the river. So our friends, the Redlegs, they came to Osceola, and they had a trial, and they executed 9 citizens as traitors. The town was burned to the ground, and the Redlegs loaded everything that they could possibly carry in wagons and headed back to Kansas. Now, a paper in St. Louis recorded the spoils of this raid, and they are as follows: tons of lead, kegs of powder, barrels of brandy, pounds of sugar, molasses, flour, coffee, bacon, hundreds of horses, mules, cattle, 2 fine carriages, and 2 pianos. All this in the name of keeping Kansas a free state. As an aside, why he killed a neighbor over a land dispute, that was in 1858, nothing came of it. And following the war, he was elected as a U.S. Senator from Kansas. And he became sort of despondent over Reconstruction. It wasn't as severe as he wanted it to be, and so he killed himself in 1866. Now, probably the most well-known bad boy is that pro-Free State character, the infamous John Brown. Now, John Brown wasn't always doing hate and discontent. He had 20 children, so he had to be home sometime. But he and his 5 sons, in the fall of 1855, moved to Osawatomie, Kansas, which is on the border of Harrisonville, Missouri. And there was now a Free State legislature which had been formed to oppose that of the legal and federal government. And Brown was elected a member of this, and he was also a leader of the Free State militia known as the Potawatomi Rifles. Now, Brown had been involved in some questionable activities, and so a United States federal judge issued a warrant for Brown and some of his followers. And the poor person who was selected for that job was Constable James P. Doyle. Well, there was a rumor that some bushwhackers were going to attack Lawrence, and so the Potawatomi Rifles all ran off there, but nothing came of that, so they all went back to Osawatomie, except for John Brown and his sons. Instead, he went looking for Constable Doyle, and he found him. And Brown executed Doyle with a shot in the head, and his sons, Brown's sons, hacked Doyle's sons to death with swords. Now, they didn't stop at that. They went on a rampage and went up a couple other homes there, and they found some other people who they killed 2 other prominent citizens and 1 poor traveling salesman who just happened to be there. No legal action was taken. John Brown, to say the least, was an evangelical Christian who believed that he was personally an instrument of God. He commanded anti-slavery forces all over the area, believing that he could bring about a slave rebellion because in Haiti years earlier, 80,000 whites had been killed by a slave uprising, and he thought he could do the same. And so he ended up attacking the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, which then was Virginia, now it's West Virginia. And Brown intended to arm the slaves with these weapons from the armory and create his own rebellion, but the plan was foiled by United States Marines under Colonel Robert E. Lee and Lieutenant J.E.B. Jeb Stuart. You may recall these people gained some prominence during the Civil War. Brown was tried for treason and hanged on December the 2nd, 1859. Abolitionists considered him to be a hero, and the Missourians rejoiced at his demise. Hostilities, of course, continued, and a new hero of the Free State movement emerged, and his name was James Montgomery. He was a school teacher and a clergyman who migrated from Ohio, settling in Kansas in 1854, and he was cut from the same cloth as Brother Brown was. Early on, he organized a self-protective company. It was in 1857, and their primary mission was to harass and drive from Kansas pro-slavery citizens. As a colonel in a militia group, he waged a no-holds-barred war on these people. Montgomery's forces stole livestock, possessions, and slaves, and this current beginning of the Civil War was becoming less civil. When the war officially broke out, he entered the U.S. Army as a colonel and continued his jayhawking raids. And following the war, he returned to Mound City, Kansas, and farmed there until his death in 1871. As you might expect, not all of the mischief came about by well-meaning political activists with lofty goals. A number of low-life thieves used the slavery issue as an excuse to plunder the more well-to-do Missourians. Now enter Charles Rainsford Doc Jennison, an equal colleague of James Montgomery. Doc Jamison operated in Vernon, Bates, Cass, and Jackson counties, stealing corn, cattle, burning buildings, stealing slaves for their emancipation through the railroad up into Canada. Jennison was considered the most brutal, the most unscrupulous of all the Jayhawkers. Jennison operated with Montgomery, and these two gentlemen were known as the Scourges of the Border. How would you like that on your resume? Scourges of the Border. On a raid to a pro-Southern town by the name of Trading Post, this was in Kansas, they held a trial and ultimately freed everyone except for poor Russell Hines, who they hung, and then they later killed Samuel Scott and Lester Moore. Now the territorial government, the United States territorial government, got wind of this, and he offered a reward for Jennison's arrest. But since he was a loyal abolitionist, nothing came of it. With the advent of the official war, Jennison was given a commission as a colonel in the state militia known as Jennison's Jayhawkers. Now, one of these Jayhawkers, you might remember this guy. He was an 18-year-old horse thief. His name was William F. Cody. Of course, we later know him as Buffalo Bill. Well, due to numerous infractions of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, Jennison, in spite of being promoted to brigadier general, he was arrested for his crimes by the feds and served a short time in prison in St. Louis. In Kansas, he was hailed as an anti-slavery hero, and after being dishonorably discharged, he returned to Kansas, where a heated exchange led to a charge of breach of the peace and shooting with intent to kill. He was acquitted. And for his jayhawking exploits, he was elected to the Kansas State Senate. He served in the legislature from 1865 to 1871, and he died of natural causes in 1884 in Lawrence, Kansas. Now, I've used this term Jayhawk a lot. Well, what about that? It seems that back in the old country, we're talking Ireland, there was a bird that was called a Jayhawk that was noted for torturing and messing with its prey before killing it. And the raids on pro-slavers seemed to fit that moniker. Now, the term Jayhawk was coined in this time of our history by an Irish immigrant by the name of Pat Devlin. Now, a heroic example of the constant border stress occurred at the Marie des Chenes River in Kansas. As I mentioned, Montgomery had been active in the area. He had been to this town and, of course, executed these gentlemen. And so a pro-slavery force out of Harrisonville headed to the Kansas community, again, of Trading Post, which had been ransacked by Montgomery and his crowd. And the leader of this group was Charles Hamilton. And he intended to arrest all of these participants. And among the warrants, there was one for a blacksmith by the name of Charles Snyder. Hamilton confronted him, but Snyder was having nothing to do with this at all. A fellow named Bell said, "Oh yeah," and he took out his pistol, but Snyder was faster than him, shot him down dead. Well, Hamilton flew into a rage over this, and so he marched the Free State prisoners to the riverbank and had them shot unarmed in cold blood. 4 men were killed outright, 6 wounded. And the blacksmith escaped and was never found. Most of the hardened militia were unmoved over this massacre, believing that justice had been served. But the jayhawking continued. During this time, the citizens of the Kansas-Missouri border were suffering not only from murder, killing, sacking, and general political unrest, but also their economy was suffering from a drought. And so many people left and moved west. The one highlight of this period of time is when the overland freight company Russell Majors Waddell in 1860 started the Pony Express. Now, a letter from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California could get there in an amazing 10 days. Jockeys would ride at 25-mile intervals. In February of 1857, President James Buchanan recommended that Kansas be admitted to the Union as a slave state. And of course, this energized those bad boys, Jim Lane, John Brown, James Montgomery, Doc Jennison, leading to increased efficient killing of stealing and relieving pro-slavery citizens in Kansas and Missouri of their possessions. The Democrat James Buchanan was elected president in 1856, and he followed his predecessor Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan waffled over the slavery issue. The new Republican Party was formed from abolitionists, Northern Democrats, and the Whig Party. And in 1860, the former Whig, Abraham Lincoln, was the Republican candidate. Now, I want to introduce you to the Blair family. Lincoln said if elected, he would appoint St. Louis local lawyer Montgomery Blair as Postmaster General. And Montgomery's brother was a U.S. congressman, and his name was Frank Blair, Jr. Now, Frank's formal education was colorful, to say the least. He had been expelled from Yale. He'd been expelled from North Carolina. And he was expelled from Princeton for shooting a fellow student. Didn't hurt him any to make Congress, though, did it? His objection to slavery was based solely on economics in order to make more jobs for whites. He proposed sending the blacks to colonies in South America. Humanitarian concerns for an enslaved people seemed not to be a concern. He was very popular with German immigrants in St. Louis, where he established a militia called the Wide Awakes. The group acted as Blair's own personal bodyguard, as well as planning to defend St. Louis against the pro-slavery people. The Missouri legislature called for an election to determine the will of the people regarding secession, and none of the delegates were dyed-in-the-wool secessionists, and a resolution was adopted to reject secession. St. Louis was home for the largest German population in all of the states. Years of civil war, high taxes, crop failures had all contributed to these Germans, called Dutch, contributed to their moving to Missouri. Many of these immigrants had extensive military experience and were fiercely loyal to their newly adopted homeland. Frank Blair's Wide Awakes, these German militia, morphed into the Home Guards, which solidified his position with his friend Abraham Lincoln and the United States Army. Blair wanted to rid the government of pro-secession supporters. Now, the officer that was currently in charge was Colonel William H. Bell, and he was a questionable ally. So, not surprisingly, Bell was relieved on March 4th, 1861, by a United States Army captain brought in from Fort Riley, Kansas, by the name of Nathaniel Lyon. He was a rabid abolitionist. In fact, his fellow officers in Fort Riley said he would actually get so excited he would foam at the mouth.
Oh dear.
Kind of like I do in sermons, I think. The plot thickens. Governor Jackson had the legal authority to organize a training camp for the Missouri State Militia, believing that the state should be prepared since only a month earlier South Carolina had taken over Fort Sumter. So the first week of May in 1861, the Missouri Militia, the commander, General Frost, a West Point graduate, was ordered to establish a legal training camp in Lindell Grove on the western outskirts of St. Louis, which is now very much near the zoo in St. Louis. 891 men trained at Camp Jackson, named after the governor, and the American flag flew over the camp. The Blair brothers and the president were concerned that they might lose Missouri to the Confederacy and had then given free rein to do whatever you needed to do to keep Missouri in the Union. And one way to achieve this goal was to oust the current commander of the United States troops and promote Lyon 4 pay grades. There's an old military man, 4 pay grades to Brigadier General. As this camp settled, news came that Arkansas had seceded from the Union on May 6, 1861. Lyon, now newly minted brigadier, was bound and determined to put a stop to the Missouri State Guard, which was a duly constituted and legal state militia. But on May 10, 1861, on his own authority, Lyon led 6,500 troops under a school teacher, Colonel Franz Siegel, with his smartly dressed German Americans, and they went to capture Camp Jackson, and they did. In an interesting coincidence, 2 West Point graduates were present in the crowd. These men would feature prominently in the U.S. coming war. One is Ulysses S. Grant. He was posted as a recruiting officer in Illinois and just happened to come across the river. And another spectator was the former Army officer and currently the president of a St. Louis streetcar company, William T. Sherman. You may remember him and his little march to the sea and burning Atlanta, that fellow. A civilian crowd became very upset when they were moving the Missouri militia to a prison, and so the crowd got hostile and they kept yelling, "Damn the Deutsch! Damn the Deutsch!" And a shot was fired, wounding a German soldier, and the soldiers then fired into the crowd, killing 28 civilians, wounded 75 others, and 2 of the victims were women and 1 was a baby in her arms. Now, Missourians who had previously supported the Union were now up in arms over this massacre. On June 10th, in 1861, Governor Claiborne Jackson, his secretary Thomas Snead, and the former governor, who was now the overall commander of the Missouri State Guard, General Sterling Price, they met with Frank Blair Jr. and Brigadier General Nathaniel Lyon at the Planter's House in downtown St. Louis. Now, Jackson said that U.S. troops could remain in St. Louis, and Missouri would remain in the Union, not to worry. Well, Lyon could stand none of this. Absolutely none of this. And this is recorded in the St. Louis newspaper of what he said. Rather than concede to the state of Missouri the right to demand that my government shall not enlist troops within her limits or bring troops into the state wherever it pleases, or move its troops at its own will into or out of or through the state, rather than concede to the state of Missouri one single instant the right to dictate to my government in any matter, however unimportant, I would rather see you and you and you and you and you and every man, woman, and child in the state dead and buried. Oh, well, guess what happened? The governor and the secretary and the commander of troops hightailed it out of town, burning bridges, tearing down telephone lines, and they headed for Jefferson City. Lyon was close behind with 17,000 troops. The legally elected civil servants of Missouri packed up their records, the great seal of the state, and headed upriver on the steamboat White Cloud. Now here's the timeline. On April 13th, 1861, Fort Sumter surrendered. Missouri State Guard was captured on May the 10th. The Battle of Philippi in West Virginia was June 3rd. The Battle of Big Bethel in Virginia was on June 10th. And on June 17th, Lyon caught up with the fleeing Missourians at Boonville, Missouri. The West Point trained Colonel John Marmaduke was put in charge. His daddy had been Missouri governor, and after the war, he was also elected governor. But he was in charge of this battle, which lasted 20 minutes. Marmaduke suffered 3 dead, 25 wounded. Lyon, out of his 17,000, lost 2 dead, 9 wounded, and 1 missing. I guess he didn't want to study war no more. The citizens of Boonville surrendered, and the Missouri forces headed to the little town of Cowskin Prairie in South Missouri near the Arkansas border. Hamilton Gamble was installed as the new, unelected governor of the state. Now, not wanting to upset the population too much, he angered those abolitionists by issuing a statement protecting slavery in the state. And by now, General Fremont had placed the state under martial law. Fremont ordered that slaves, or at least slaves of Confederate sympathizers, should be freed. Lincoln countermanded this order. This was an attempt to appease the planters and kept Missouri slavery alive by the will of the President of the United States. Lyon's forces were holed up at the railhead in Rolla and Springfield. Franz Sigel's force headed up the river, got to Kansas City, and went down the border where they encountered General Price's ragged Missouri militia, a little bit north of Carthage, Missouri, on July the 5th. Sigel's Germans were defeated. The Battle of Carthage is the first major battle of the Civil War. The Battle of Manassas Junction, known as Bull Run, came 2 weeks later. So Missouri had the first major battle. The next encounter in these parts, of course, happened at Wilson Creek. If you haven't been to the battlefield up there, I certainly encourage you to go. We call it Oak Hill, but it's the same battle. Lyon's forces surprised the unsuspecting Missourians, and after 6 hours, Colonel Sigel took his troops, fled the field, and sometimes later, General Lyon was killed on Bloody Hill. Running out of water, ammunition, and will, the surviving leader, Major Samuel Sturgis, retreated back to Springfield. Confederate soldiers from Arkansas and the Missouri State Guard fielded 10,200 men. 1,230 lost their lives. The Union lost 1,216 out of 5,400 men. Prior to all this, all the battles against Union forces had been fought by the Missouri State Guard. a force that was independent from the Confederacy. It was fighting for the state's rights against what they considered to be an invasion of the state by federal forces. Now, Lexington, Missouri is up on the river, and this is the next encounter. It housed an arsenal that had 3,500 Union men from the Irish Brigade coming down from Iowa. And they were led by an Irishman by the name of Colonel James Mulligan, and he was reluctant to surrender the arsenal and also the $900,000 that he had appropriated from a local bank. A siege took place. Eventually, on the 20th of September, Mulligan surrendered. Following the surrender, the general and the governor and everybody invited him to supper. I thought that was very nice. Casualties were light, probably because the Missourians had soaked hip bales for barricades, and Missouri lost 25 killed, 72 wounded. The Federals lost 39 killed, 120 wounded. After the surrender, this is probably the worst part, the soldiers had to stack arms and listen to a speech by Governor Jackson. Can you imagine how galling that would be? After, they didn't give short talks in those days either, and after the governor finished haranguing him, he paroled them all and sent them all back to Iowa. And then on October 28, 1861, in the Masonic Hall at Neosho, Missouri, the duly elected members of the Missouri legislature passed the Act of Secession and officially joined the Confederacy. So we have this government in exile, since the state was occupied by the federal government, and we have the provisional state government unelected. In spite of the decision at Neosho, the federal government never accepted this vote to secede. In our area of the Trans-Mississippi, the next major engagement was at the ill-fated Battle of Elkhorn Tavern. You all know Pea Ridge. If you haven't been there, I recommend you go there and see that. General Price's force of the State Guard numbered 5,500 of the entire force of 8,000. General Van Dorn was a terrible leader, and the two extremely good, competent generals, McCulloch and McIntosh, were killed. Confederate losses hovered around 1,400 men. The Union victory at Pea Ridge kept the Federals in control of Missouri, but it was a very fragile existence. And now we're going to come to the general orders by General Henry Halleck. In December of 1861, he issued General Order Number 31, which imposed martial law on the state, and among other things, said if you were caught destroying property, any government property, you would be shot. General Order Number 2, March 13, 1862, stated that guerrillas were outlaws and they would be summarily shot. And General Order 19 said that all able-bodied men of fighting age must join the Union militia. 52,000 did, many did not. Those who joined because they didn't want to get shot joined the Union not because they believed in it, but because they didn't want to get shot. They were called pawpaws. Now, enter Frank James. General Order 19 was responsible for Frank's involvement to the degree that he was involved in. He had been part of General Price's army and was captured in Springfield and paroled and took the oath to support the Union and went home. Then General Order Number 19 came along and said, doesn't matter, you got to join the Union forces, and that sent Frank into hiding. General Order 19 also passed the Confederate Congress, and this is when they passed the Partisan Ranger Act, which commissioned partisans to be official Confederate soldiers on independent duty. And now we enter the saga of Jesse James. the Union militia were looking for Frank. So they went to the homestead. Ma and Pa and the kids were all at home. Frank's stepfather was a physician. And so they went to interrogate the family, and they didn't have much luck. So they tied a rope around Frank's dad and hung him 7 times. Just long enough, to keep him alive, let him down. It created brain damage for the rest of his life. He was totally incapable of functioning. So they didn't get any information from the family. So they spied young Jesse, 14 years old, down in the field plowing. And so they went down to have a little conversation with Jesse, and they just beat the tar out of him. Well, as you might guess, this sealed his fate, and he joined the cause. More on that later. The next bad boy is William Quantrill. He was a former school teacher. He'd lived in Ohio for a while and migrated to Kansas. And on his way there, some of the jayhawking redlegs encountered him, stole his wagon, took all his possessions, killed his 18-year-old brother, shot him in the leg, and stole his slave. Now, following his recovery, he became one of the worst nightmares for the citizens of Kansas. His most famous exploit, of course, was the successful raid on Lawrence, where his troops murdered, stole, and burned. The Lawrence Massacre at dawn on August 21st, 1863. Quantrill, with 400 of his guerrillas, rode into Lawrence, and the first Kansas citizen killed was the Reverend Mr. Snyder, who was shot while milking his cow. At the end of the day, somewhere between 160 and 190 men and boys were killed. Well, why Lawrence? Well, it was the seat of anti-slavery. It was the home of Jim Lane. And it was also Quantrill's revenge. The raid led to Union General Thomas Ewing issuing General Order Number 11, and that was to evacuate all residents in Jackson, Cass, Bates, and Vernon County and move them all north. In 1862, Quantrill was commissioned as a captain in the Confederate Army. He raised hell throughout the war, of course, the raid on Lawrence, later the Battle of Independence, the burning of Olathe, Kansas, the raid on Lamar, Missouri, and the Battle of Baxter Springs, where 100 Union soldiers were killed. It was common for the partisans to winter in Texas, where the leaders disagreed on various issues, and Quantrill broke from the group and eventually ended up right before the war ended in Kentucky. And there he was wounded and paralyzed and eventually died in one of the very last battles of the war. On April 9th, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. By the way, I don't know if you know this, but the family that lived in Appomattox House had lived in Pennsylvania and moved down to Virginia to get out of trouble. Some of us make strange decisions, don't we? And on April 26th, General Joe Johnson surrendered to General Sherman. Now, Quantrill died on June 6, 1865. He was 27 years old. I'm always amazed at how young these fellows were. 27 years old. He was initially buried in the cemetery in Louisville, in the Catholic cemetery there. Got some notes here somewhere. It was kind of interesting. Later, in 1887, his mother and his good friend, William Scott, decided to go to the cemetery, and they dug up the grave, and they found some bones and his skull. Now, his good friend, William Scott, said, "Don't worry, Mom, I'll take the bones and bury them." Well, eventually he did bury some of the bones in 1889, but he decided he would sell Quantrell's skull. What a friend. So eventually the skull ended up in a fraternity. I think it was probably KA. It would make sense anyway. And they used that skull all the way up until 1942 as a initiation rite. But in 1972, the fraternity donated it to the Kansas Historical Society, and eventually it ended up with a formal burial in Higginsville. Now, Maltese crosses are used on these because they represent for the Confederacy the Cross of Honor. Now, as you see, we have several burial places. So he was originally buried in Louisville, then in Ohio, and then eventually, thanks be to the fraternity, he ended up in the little town of Higginsville, Missouri, which is not too far away from where our farm was. Now, speaking of wintering in Texas, even though not technically involved in the war, there is a lady who certainly was involved with the guerrillas, especially with Cole Younger. And it was said that her daughter was sired by Cole, and I'll give you some more on this later. But what about this bad boy, Cole Younger? Younger was born to a prominent Jackson County farm family. His father was a devoted Union supporter, but was shot dead by a Union soldier. And again, after that, Cole sought revenge. How often this happened. And he did very well, being involved in all of Quantrell's operations. And following the war, most of the former bushwhackers returned to peaceful lives, but Cole and his brothers hooked up with the James Gang. Cole's outlaw career, along with his brother Jim and Bob, ended in the unsuccessful raid of Northfield, Minnesota. Bob Younger died in prison. Cole and Jim were paroled in July of 1901. Jim committed suicide a year later, but Cole got the fine job of lecturing in a Wild West show. Now, he became a Christian, was baptized in Lee Summit, Missouri Christian Church in August of 1913. He died in 1916, and he is buried in that cemetery there. Well, what about this mysterious woman that Cole Younger had this fling with back in Texas? Her name was Myra Maybelle Shirley Reed Starr, commonly known as Belle. Belle was born in Carthage, Missouri. Her father ran a tavern there until things got too hot, and he decided he would move the family down to Cyrene, Texas, and this is where most of the bushwhackers would go to winter, kind of snowbirds in a way. She was apparently a very accomplished pianist, but she did like the men, and so she had quite a history. She was married to James Reed, who was a bushwhacker, and he was killed in 1874. She married Sam Starr, who was a Cherokee, and that lasted for 6 years when he died in 1886. And then she married his brother, Jim July Starr, who was a very accomplished horse thief. And that lasted for 1 year until she was shot and killed in 1889 down near Fort Smith. And it was a property dispute. The man that killed her was never charged. She was 41 years old. And now I will introduce you to William Bloody Bill Anderson. He was born in Randolph County, just a few miles from my folks' historic farm there. But his family moved him to Kansas at a fairly early age, and as he grew up, he decided that stealing horses was a very lucrative business. And so he and his brothers were very much involved in that until he got tangled up with a judge, and he killed the judge and the judge's son, and so he decided that he'd best come over to Missouri for some safety. And then he joined the outlaw gang, the people who attacked Lawrence, and had a fairly lucrative career as a bushwhacker, and was doing okay until there was a general order, another one of those general orders that came out that said any women who were involved in, are sympathetic to anyone in the Confederate cause would be imprisoned. And so his sisters, along with several other women, were imprisoned in a very rickety old building at 14th and Grand in Kansas City. And a storm blew it down and killed many of the women. It killed his eldest sister and crippled his younger sister. Now, Bill was bad before this, but he was the devil himself after this. If you want some of the exploits, buy the book. But besides killing and stealing and raping his way across Missouri, the most heinous event occurred in Centralia, Missouri, where he ambushed a train filled with Union soldiers on leave heading back to Iowa. 22 of these soldiers were stripped down to their skivvies and murdered in cold blood. Some Union troops were coming, but they got there too late to stop this particular massacre. But this is how I'm going to tell you why the bushwhackers were so successful. I need an able-bodied person, all right? This is a Springfield 58 caliber. You're able-bodied.
Captain.
He's also a deputy.
Take this, son. You're used to these. Now, all right, the bushwhackers would arm themselves many times with these Navy Colts, maybe sometimes as many as 10 or 15 of them, stuck in pockets and everything like this. How many shots does that have? One shot. How many do we have here? We got 12 right here already. So also there's a tendency when you fire the first round, we discovered this in the Marine Corps, when you shoot in 3-round bursts, otherwise the weapon goes up like this. You see. So Union troops would aim it up at me, shoot me. But what had happened, it'd fire up like this. And then right in the bushwhackers. Bang, bang, bang. And that is why they were so successful over and over and over again. Well, eventually the Union realized this, and they set a trap. The bushwhackers also would send a few men in. They would have the Union troops come and run after them, and then they would ambush them. So finally, the Union decided this would probably be a good thing to do. And so they did this to Bloody Bill and his gang. And Bloody Bill ran into an ambush of 150 rifles. And that, as you may guess, ended his ruthless career. His head was cut off and placed on top of a pole at the courthouse in Richmond, Missouri. And it was extremely popular for the citizens to go and urinate on his grave. Now, General Price had planned on recapturing Missouri, and after some small battles, his forces ended up at the Battle of Westport, which is now the Country Club Plaza in Kansas City. Price's forces were overwhelmed by a superior force, and his army retreated south. The battle between General Samuel Curtis of the Union and General Price occurred on October 23rd, 1864, and was the largest battle of the Civil War west of the Mississippi River. So we had the first large battle and the last battle occurred in my fine state. It was known as the Gettysburg of the West. It was 16 months following Lee's surrender at Appomattox that the war officially ended in August of 1866. This was due to a great deal to post-war confusion, especially in Texas, where many former Confederates refused to give up the cause. And so the bloody war finally ended. Old John Brown lay moldering in the grave, as the song said. The Kansas Jayhawkers were either dead or serving in Congress. The James Younger gang flourished, hitting northern banks and railroads, which were very popular among Southern supporters in my state. Jesse was, of course, dead, killed in 1882 at the age of 34. Bloody Bill was gone and still hated. Now, by 1865, 110,000 Missouri boys had served the Union. 40,000 had served the Confederacy. Now, over 1,000 battles were fought in the state of Missouri. It is the third most fought over state in the war. Virginia and Tennessee, first, second, and Missouri was the most. And in 1 year, in the first year of the war, in 1861, 42% of the battles in the whole country occurred in Missouri. And that is the rest of the story, the rest of the history. Thank you very much.